All right, so we are diving right into this potential ceasefire in Ukraine. You sent over a bunch of articles about this phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin, and some of the details are pretty wild, to say the least.
It is a complicated situation, for sure.
Like right off the bat, one article mentions dividing up assets, including land and power plants. I mean, it's not every day you hear that kind of language in peace talks. It's like, are we bartering or are we trying to create peace? What's your take on all that?
It's definitely unusual. It's not usually how things are done, right? Typically in these early stages, everything's very carefully worded. It's about finding common ground and not, outlining concessions publicly. But I guess by putting these specifics out there, Trump is signaling that he's willing to make deals. But it does make you wonder, is he overstepping his role here? Is this America dictating terms rather than actually facilitating a real peace process?
And the timing's interesting, too. This call happened on March 18th, 2025, just after U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff met with Putin in Moscow. Witkoff seemed pretty optimistic afterwards, even hinting at progress toward a peace deal. So is this all connected somehow?
It seems very likely. That meeting probably set the stage for this direct presidential phone call.
Yeah.
And the result of that is we have this initial agreement for a 30-day ceasefire, specifically targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure.
Okay, so that's got to be at least some relief for people in Ukraine, especially with winter coming up. But one article highlighted a potential problem. Russia's demanding a complete halt to all foreign military and intelligence aid to Ukraine as a condition for the ceasefire.
Yeah, that's a big red flag. It would completely change the dynamic.
Right, because how can Ukraine negotiate if they are essentially cut off from their allies? What kind of leverage would Zelensky even have?
Exactly. That's a
Right.
huge question mark.
But on the other hand, isn't Russia also feeling the pressure to end this thing? I mean, one article mentioned how the economic sanctions are really starting to bite, and there's growing discontent among the Russian people, too.
Right.
So maybe the ceasefire is a way for Putin to save face and de-escalate things without looking weak.
That's certainly possible. Russia's not immune to the consequences of this war, so a ceasefire could very well serve their interests too.
But the key question is, what concessions are they actually willing to make? And this brings us back to that whole dividing up assets issue.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. Trump specifically mentioned the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest, as one of the assets that would likely be discussed. I mean, it's a huge deal. And then there's his comments about Ukrainian soldiers being in deep trouble in the Kursk region, which is territory that Ukraine currently holds. So is he basically saying that Ukraine needs to be prepared to give up some land for this deal to happen? That's certainly how some analysts are interpreting it. And it is worrying. These aren't small concessions. These are big things. Negotiating control of a nuclear power plant raises all kinds of issues about safety and security, not to mention what it means for Ukraine's energy independence. And giving up territory that they fought so hard for would be a tough pill to swallow for Zelensky, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I was just reading an excerpt from one of Zelensky's speeches from a few months ago. He was adamant that Ukraine would not give up an inch of its sovereign territory. And he's been pretty distrustful of Putin in the past, to say the least. How do you think he's going to react to all of this?
That's the big question, isn't it? Because while the U.S. and Russia are the ones at the negotiating table right now, ultimately Ukraine's the one that has to agree to any of this. Their willingness to accept these terms is what will make or break any deal.
And that leads to another point that keeps coming up in these articles, the concern that Ukraine's interests might be pushed aside in these direct U.S.-Russia talks. Some experts are even calling it a nightmare scenario.
Right. The concern is that this sets a dangerous precedent. If the U.S. is seen as negotiating over Ukrainian territory without Ukraine's full involvement, it could really embolden Russia. And it kind of undermines the idea of a rules-based international order. Imagine the message it sends to other countries in the region. If you get invaded, your fate might be decided by the big powers, not by you.
It's not just a hypothetical either. One article pointed out that Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have all withdrawn from the Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel mines. They specifically cited the changing security landscape. So it seems like they're pretty spooked by this whole situation.
Oh, absolutely. It's a clear sign that this U.S.-Russia ceasefire isn't just about Ukraine. It has implications for the whole region. Those countries are looking at this and thinking if Ukraine can be pressured into making concessions, what's stopping Russia from coming after us next?
So we have this White House statement emphasizing their desire to improve relations with Russia. They even mention enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability. But then on the other hand, you have U.S. allies in Europe who are feeling increasingly uneasy about all of this. How do you reconcile those two perspectives?
That's the dilemma at the heart of this whole thing, right? Can the U.S. pursue its own interests like better relations with Russia or potentially some big economic deals without sacrificing the interests of its allies and potentially throwing the whole region into chaos?
So much to unpack here. We have this initial agreement, but it's fragile for sure, and it comes with some pretty big strings attached. And then there are so many unanswered questions. Will Ukraine actually accept these terms? Will Russia actually honor the ceasefire? And what exactly is Ukraine expected to give up in the process?
Yeah, those are the key questions that we need to consider as we dig deeper into all of this. And maybe the biggest question, is this actually a path to peace, or are we heading down a road that leads to more conflict and more instability?
So we were just talking about how fragile this ceasefire seems. And with all these conditions and unanswered questions, one of the things that struck me in these articles is this idea that this whole thing might actually embolden Russia in the long run. I mean, how could a ceasefire make things worse?
Well, it all comes down to precedent, right?
Yeah.
If Russia sees that they can achieve their objectives, or at least some of them, through military force, and then negotiations where Ukraine is pressured into making concessions, it creates this really dangerous dynamic. It basically tells them, hey, this tactic works. And what's to stop them from trying it again, either against Ukraine or maybe even against one of their other neighbors?
So it's not just about this one conflict, it's about the bigger picture and what message this sends to other potential aggressors.
Exactly. And that's why some analysts are so concerned about the U.S.'s role in all of this.
Hmm.
Are they really trying to broker a lasting peace? Or are they putting their relationship with Russia first, even if it means sacrificing Ukraine's interests?
That's a really good question, especially when you consider Trump's language about dividing up assets. It just feels so transactional, so cold. One article even quoted a Ukrainian political scientist who said it sounded more like a business deal than a peace negotiation.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way. It adds to this sense of unease about whether Ukraine's interests are really being represented in these talks. They're the ones whose country has been invaded, whose cities have been bombed, whose people have been killed and displaced. But their voice seems to be getting lost in all of this.
We keep talking about Putin and Trump, but you're right. We need to focus more on Zelensky. He's been so steadfast in his refusal to give up any territory. Just a few months ago, he gave that speech where he said, "We will fight for every inch of our land, for every house, for every street." It's hard to imagine him just caving to pressure now, especially with what happened in Crimea still so fresh in everyone's minds.
It would be very surprising to see him agree to any deal that involves significant territorial concessions. And you have to remember, he already agreed to a 30-day ceasefire under a previous U.S. plan. This new deal, with the demand for a complete halt to foreign aid, puts him in a much weaker position.
Right. One article even laid out a scenario where Zelensky just rejects this deal completely, and then the fighting actually escalates as a result. It painted a pretty grim picture of what that could look like. A full-scale Russian offensive, maybe even targeting Kyiv.
It's definitely a possibility. And it just goes to show how risky these negotiations are. There's always a chance of miscalculation, of pushing too hard and ending up with the opposite of what you were hoping for.
That brings up another question. What if the ceasefire just falls apart completely? What if the negotiations go nowhere? What happens then?
Well, then we're probably looking at a long, drawn-out war with no clear end in sight. And that has some pretty huge implications, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire region. You could see a massive refugee crisis, more economic problems, and there's always the risk of the conflict spreading to neighboring countries.
One article I read even suggested that this could lead to a new Cold War between the U.S. and Russia. They talked about increased military spending, proxy wars in other parts of the world, and a constant threat of things escalating. It was kind of scary, to be honest.
That's definitely a worst-case scenario. But it's not something we can just ignore. The stakes are incredibly high. A failure to find a peaceful solution in Ukraine could really destabilize the entire world.
It's a lot to think about for sure. And it makes you wonder what other options there might be. Is there any other way forward besides the ceasefire agreement and these high-stakes negotiations?
I think there are always other options, but they require a different way of thinking. We need to move away from this idea of a zero-sum game that seems to be driving everything right now.
What do you mean by a zero-sum game?
It's this idea that one side's gain has to come at the expense of the other side. That if one side wins, the other side automatically loses. And that kind of thinking is often what leads to conflict in the first place. It prevents cooperation.
Okay, so what would a different approach look like in this case?
I think it would start with recognizing that there are some shared interests here. The security of Europe as a whole is something everyone benefits from. A peaceful and stable Ukraine is in everyone's best interest, including Russia's.
That's a pretty idealistic view. Do you really think that's realistic given how bad things are between Russia and the West right now?
Being realistic doesn't have to mean being cynical. It can also mean recognizing the long-term costs of conflict and the potential benefits of cooperation, even with people you don't agree with.
Okay, so let's say for a minute that this different approach is possible. What concrete steps could be taken to make it happen?
Well, it starts with dialogue. It starts with building trust and finding some common ground. It means addressing Russia's security concerns while also respecting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It means finding ways to cooperate on issues where our interests align, even as we disagree on other things.
And this would have to involve more than just the U.S. and Russia, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It would require a much broader international effort. The UN, the EU, NATO, they all need to be part of creating a framework for lasting peace and stability in the region.
That's a lot to ask, but you're saying it's at least worth trying, even if it seems like a long shot.
I think we owe it to the people of Ukraine and to ourselves to explore every possible path to peace, because the alternative, a long and bloody conflict that could potentially escalate, is just too dangerous to even think about.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the implications of this ceasefire to the broader geopolitical situation, and even some alternative ways of thinking about the problem. I have to say I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by all the different possibilities, both good and bad.
It's a complex situation, no doubt, and there's no way to know for sure how things will play out. But I think it's important to remember that even in the midst of all this uncertainty and danger, there's always room for hope, for creative diplomacy, for the pursuit of peace.
Okay, so I'm still trying to process all of this. We've talked about the risks of this ceasefire, the negotiations, and even some different ways of approaching the problem. But at the end of the day, there's still so much we just don't know. So where do we go from here? What are some of the possible outcomes?
Well, I think it's important to remember that predicting the future is pretty much impossible, especially in a situation like this that's constantly changing. But we can look at the potential paths forward and think about what could happen in both the best and worst case scenarios.
Okay, so let's try to be optimistic for a minute. What would the best case scenario look like here?
Well, in the best case, this 30-day ceasefire on energy infrastructure actually holds.
Yeah.
And both sides use that time to build some trust and have some serious good faith negotiations.
Right. But Russia still wants all foreign aid to Ukraine cut off. And they've made it pretty clear that they want to take some territory. Is there any way to reach an agreement that satisfies both sides without Ukraine feeling like they got a bad deal?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Finding a solution that works for everyone, or at least minimizes everyone's losses. One possibility, and it's a long shot, I'll admit, is that Russia agrees to a phased withdrawal from Ukrainian territory. Maybe they start by pulling back from areas that aren't as strategically important to them.
And in exchange, Ukraine would have to make some concessions too, right? Maybe agree to stay neutral or limit their military cooperation with the West.
Yeah, exactly. It would have to be a compromise where both sides recognize that neither one of them is going to get everything they want.
One article mentioned the possibility of security guarantees for Ukraine from the West, like a promise that if Russia ever tries something like this again, NATO will come to their defense. Do you think that's realistic?
It's an interesting idea,
Hmm.
but it's hard to imagine how it would work in practice. NATO membership for Ukraine is a non-starter for Russia. They wouldn't accept anything that even comes close to that.
So even in the best case scenario, there are still some major hurdles. And that doesn't even address the issue of foreign aid. Russia seems really insistent on cutting that off entirely.
True. But maybe there's room for some compromise there too. Perhaps they'd be open to gradually reducing aid over time as part of a larger peace agreement.
So in this optimistic scenario, we're talking about a really long and difficult process with lots of tough decisions along the way. But at the end of it all, there's a lasting peace agreement that protects Ukraine's sovereignty and prevents more fighting. That's what we're all hoping for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But we also need to be realistic about the possibility that things could go very wrong.
Okay, so let's talk about the other side of the coin. What's the worst case scenario here? What happens if the ceasefire falls apart or if the negotiations just go nowhere?
That's a much more worrying possibility. In that scenario, we could be looking at a long and bloody war where neither side is willing to back down. The fighting could get even worse, with Russia maybe launching a new offensive to take more territory, maybe even trying to capture Kyiv.
And the human cost is already so high. Tens of thousands of people have died, millions have been displaced, and the destruction is widespread. A longer conflict would only make those numbers worse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the longer this drags on, the greater the risk that it spills over into neighboring countries. You could see a massive refugee crisis that overwhelms Europe, economic problems that impact the whole world, And there's even a chance of direct military clash between NATO and Russia.
One article talked about a new Cold War with constant tension, proxy wars all over the globe, and the possibility of a nuclear conflict. It was honestly pretty terrifying to read.
It's very sobering thought.
Ah,
And it really underscores how important it is to de-escalate the situation and find a way to break this cycle of hostility and distrust.
but is that even possible at this point? Russia seems determined to get what it wants no matter what, and the West seems equally determined to support Ukraine and resist Russian aggression. It feels like we're trapped in a stalemate.
Yeah, it definitely feels that way sometimes. But even in the darkest moments, it's important to remember that things can change. There can be unexpected breakthroughs. Diplomacy can sometimes prevail over conflict.
So you're saying we shouldn't give up hope, that there's still a chance for a peaceful resolution?
I think it's crucial to hold on to hope, even as we recognize the challenges ahead. Resigning ourselves to a future of endless conflict is just not an option.
You've given us a lot to consider. This whole situation is so complicated with so many layers. It's hard to say what the future holds, but I know we'll be paying close attention to how this unfolds.
I agree. This is a turning point in history, and the decisions that are made over the next few weeks and months will have huge consequences for Ukraine, for the region, and for the whole world. It's a situation that deserves our attention, our thoughtful engagement, and our continued hope for a peaceful resolution.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder all of this. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those critical thinking caps on. Until next time, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.